I rise today in requesting for an adjournment in memory of the last great civil rights leader of the 20th century, Nelson Mandela. I was deeply saddened, as so many of you were, to hear of his passing. We knew of his illness, we knew of his impending death, and yet his death hit us no less in terms of knowing that this great man, who lived only 95 years, was gone from us. Nelson Mandela was born in 1918 in the Transvaal region of South Africa. He became an active anti-apartheid leader in his early 20s. He joined the African National Congress and formed the youth arm of that Congress to engage in nonviolent protest throughout South Africa. He symbolized for many of us the continuing struggle to create justice and freedom for a nation that was captured in something called apartheid, our version of Jim Crow. He was arrested several times in South Africa and often charged with treason simply for asking for his right as an African citizen to be free, to be able to move about the country without having to carry passes, to be able to live his life just as a normal citizen. He was arrested in 1956. He was again arrested in 1961 for orchestrating protest. And eventually in 1963, he was convicted supposedly of treason and sentenced to life in prison. He represented not only just him, but so many other members of the African National Congress. And so while we celebrate him, we have to celebrate all of those who struggle so hard to bring justice and freedom. Nelson Mandela was incarcerated for 27 years, 18 of those years on Robben Island. And I had the unique pleasure of traveling to South Africa 9 times and visiting Robben Island and visiting the places that he was kept and seeing the abhorrent conditions and knowing that the conditions had weakened his health, his eyes, and his lungs. And yet knowing at the same time that while he was in prison, prison was never in him. He transformed the prisons into places of learning and teaching and growth for the members of the prison. And he made them stronger as advocates for freedom and justice. The interesting thing about Nelson Mandela is that he was a man of pure passion for freedom. I had the unique pleasure of traveling to Los Angeles to be in the presence of Nelson Mandela after being incarcerated for 27 years. And being in the huge throng of individuals at the LA Coliseum, we all felt a connection to a person who really believed in freedom and justice. Things that people talk about, but seldom are willing to give their lives for it. Nelson Mandela was uncompromising. He refused to give in. He refused to compromise his principles in order to be free. And so therefore he stands as a living example of what happens when you really believe in the principles that are there and you give your life for it. We often read about give me freedom or give me death, but seldom do we see people who really mean it. It is interesting to me that he came out of prison, not bitter, but more passionate about freedom. He came out with a commitment and a desire to create, for the first time in this world, a multicultural nation, one where there were a number of individuals with different points of view who had equality and justice. And while that vision is still there, has yet to be fully achieved, he has set the groundwork in the constitution of that nation and the efforts that are there. He once said that prison itself is a tremendous education in the need for patience and perseverance. He said it is above all the test of one's commitment. And after 27 years, I think he passed the test. He was a giant in every sense of the word, a person I admired immensely, a person that I saw transform a nation, but also transformed a world. And so it's with that I ask you to adjourn in memory. Nelson Mandela said, death is something inevitable. When a man has done what he considers to be his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. I believe I have made that effort, and that is therefore why I will sleep for eternity, he says. To the people of the world, he felt a commitment to freedom and justice, and now he was truly sleep for eternity in peace. May God bless Nelson Mandela. May God bless South Africa, and may God bless the world for embracing him at this time. I ask that you adjourn in his memory.
I too rise asking that we pay tribute to an iconic figure in the struggle for justice and human dignity, Nelson Mandela. When we received word of President Mandela's passing, I know that many of us felt a profound sense of loss and sorrow after the passing of a man whose life was spent serving the cause of justice. Many of us had the opportunity to participate in memorials throughout the state that paid tribute to President Mandela. Assemblymember Skinner and I participated in one such event at UC Berkeley, and it was a fitting event. When you look at the historic role of students and faculty and community in Berkeley embracing and championing a student-based anti-apartheid effort. But indeed, in universities throughout the country and throughout the world, the power of Mandela's message and opposition to apartheid took root. And while the government could imprison him for 27 years, they couldn't imprison his voice. It was a voice that then took on new form. It took on the form of students who came together and people of conscience who took action. And actually in 1966, when Bobby Kennedy spoke at the University of Cape Town on the Day of Affirmation, he gave one of the most powerful speeches that he would give. And it was inspired again by this powerful lesson that we all see. Bobby Kennedy said, "Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against an injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." And that really captures the movement that continued on. The activism that we saw, the empowerment of people to know that they could take action in their own way to bring upon this difference. In Los Angeles, about 2 miles from where I grew up at Occidental College, in 1981, the students built a shanty town, drawing attention to the horrors of apartheid. And there was a young student at that college who got up and spoke at an anti-apartheid rally and gave his first public speech. He's now the President of the United States. The ability to take ownership for the role that each of us can play in changing the world really goes so much further than just the question of apartheid. But the powerful force that Robert Kennedy spoke of that is most clearly embodied in the life of Nelson Mandela. And I remember in 1988, Hugh Masekela coming to the Berkeley campus to perform a song, "Bring Him Home," a song that was banned in apartheid-era South Africa because Mandela had the daring to include the name of Mandela in the lyrics. But again, they could imprison his body but not his voice. Each of these came to create the powerful undercurrent that we saw taking root throughout the world. On campuses across the state, students called for divestiture of UC assets. And in the end, the University of California divested itself of $3.1 billion in assets in apartheid-era South Africa. And many stood back and said it was the wrong thing to do, that it would cause more harm to the people of South Africa. As much as we have seen the world embrace Mandela in the last few years and months, at the heart of his activism, he was reviled by many. And so it is not enough to talk about the great outcomes of his life, but to be honest about the assessments in real time and the bravery of those who stood up. And I'm actually proud that this chamber has a role as well, because it was in this chamber that the first divestiture bill passed, ultimately signed by Governor Deukmejian, divesting California of all its assets in South Africa. Again, this state playing our role in bringing an end to the apartheid-era government of South Africa. it is an important lesson to us all that it is not enough to celebrate Nelson Mandela, but we must reflect on the actions of his life. When he walked out of Robben Island and into the presidency of South Africa, he brought together a nation that many said could never be united. And that's because of his powerful belief not just in equality in the eyes of the law, but equality and acceptance in the hearts and minds of every citizen. It is a powerful example for our state, a state that prides itself in our amazing breadth of a diversity, where the work we do is the embodiment of the first charge of our Constitution to build a more perfect union. The world has lost a revered figure, one who reminds us that each of us can be part of something greater than ourselves, and that each of us have the capacity to create real and tangible change in the world we live in, and that each of us have an obligation to stand up for the rights of others and speak out against injustice. So as we celebrate his life and legacy, let us reaffirm our commitment to honor the legacy by doing our part to make this world worthy of the life that Nelson Mandela spent changing it.
Nelson Mandela's legacy of leadership, patience, and forgiveness showed the world the character and integrity of a world leader that the world leader must possess in order to heal and unify a divided country. He was a leader that stood the oppressive and destructive nature of apartheid and the complexity of putting a torn country back together again as president. He was kind, gentle, yet fierce and forceful. As a member of the Black press, my experience was that we kept that story on our front pages, and not just once or twice, but for years. And through those stories that we kept on our front page, we came in contact with, met, and became friends with many of those who are in the South African community. Mine in Southern California, other Black press members across the nation. Whenever we looked at what was going on in California, California had an ANC. The president was Vusi Mdaweni. His wife was Tula Mdaweni. Miriam Makeba was very much a part of it. And many of those in Los Angeles and up and down the state were touched by the things that were happening in South Africa and the stories that they were telling us about Mr. Mandela. He was and will remain one of my role models. In our darkest hours, I will remember the words, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave person is one who does not feel afraid, but one who conquers the fear." I too join in voicing my colleagues and asking for adjournment in a wonderful, wonderful human being, Mr. Nelson Mandela. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, I rise to request unanimous consent to allow for us to suspend the rules to allow for demonstration. Traditionally, at the end of significant adjourns in memory, we ask for a moment of silence, but today I'd ask for a responsorial where Dr. Weber and I would lead in the traditional chant of Mandela, and those willing would respond Awetu. So I ask for unanimous consent.
Without objection, unanimous consent has been granted. I will turn it over to Ms. Weber.
So again,
Speaker.
it's Mandela Awetu, Mandela Awetu.
Amandala!
Awetu,
Amandala!
Awetu.